So I am so thrilled because one of the very first exhibition that I got to work on here at Zygote Press was with these two astounding humans and amazing artists, Morrissey and Lenore Thomas, who are here tonight. Yeah, feel free to start your videos if you guys want to show your faces or not. You can do whichever you want. We just would appreciate if you kept yourself muted during the presentation. And then at the end for the Q&A, you can unmute and ask away, ask your questions. So I'm here in Zygote's physical space, the gallery right now. In fact, I could do a quick, very low tech pan around the gallery space. It's such a beautiful show. And if you haven't had a chance to see it in person, we do have a couple of ways for you to see it. We have a virtual form of the exhibition, and we have a YouTube walkthrough video that actually physically walks through the video. Jackie's going to drop those in the chat as the night goes on for you to take a look at. Or if you want to come here in person to Zygote, we have gallery hours on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 12 to 4. You don't need an appointment. Just show up and ring our bell, and one of our gallery monitors will let you in. Obviously, you have to wear a mask when you're in here, but there's no one in here except me. I'm all alone, so I'm not wearing a mask tonight. But anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I created a PowerPoint so that we can talk more about, can everyone see my screen and all these windows that don't matter? Let's see. Just going to make this speaker view. How does that look? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Great. We'll just put it down here in that corner. All right. So the show that's currently on view right now in our gallery is called Tiny Roads That Lead to Nowhere. It opened on July 16th, and it will be open until August 29th. On Saturday, August 28th, Saturday, August 28th, we are having a closing reception and an all-day open house from 12 to 5. I'll be giving guided tours of the exhibition on that day. Obviously, people have to come in small groups. So if you're around the Cleveland area on that Saturday, that would be a great day to come and see the show. So just to kind of start out, my first question is, I was wondering, in fact, let me do it this way so we can see both of your smiling faces that way. I was wondering how the two of you met and how the two of you first crossed paths as artists and as people.
Yeah, I think I'll start with this one. So I had known about Lenore's work for a while, and when I was an undergraduate student at Bowling Green in Ohio, and my professor at the time, Dusty Herbig, was actually in graduate school with Lenore, and I had gone to a conference in 2008, a Southern Graphics Council conference in Richmond, Virginia, out of a show that I was in. And as I walked out, there was Dusty, who had just taken another position in another school, and standing next to Lenore. And of course I was like, oh, it's Lenore. Oh, you have that sort of undergrad moment of like, oh my goodness, I know who this person is. And that was the first time we were introduced. And it was a very nice and quick sort of hello. And I think it must have been 2 years later. And we might have probably, seen each other in passing between 2008 and 2010. But then in 2010, Lenore was at the Bemis in Omaha while I was in graduate school at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and needed some sort of like screen print stuff. And that was where we reconnected, really from that point all the way to the present day. So I don't know if you have more to add, Lenore, little extra bits.
No, I mean,
she has no comment.
Yeah. And then, you know, when
I
I
feel
when
old now, but I'll say that I feel old.
yeah. But, you know, also, I think that when I moved back to Pittsburgh in 2011 after graduate school, and Lenore was like really the first person I connected with, and was, you know, we frequently had meals together, and, you know, and she invited me into a class as a visiting artist. It was sort of a really wonderful, great thing to have after graduate school, and not have really a support or a network or a system in a new, well, not really a new place, but a newer place for me, because I hadn't really been there in so many years, and everything had changed so much. And to have somebody who, you know, was really ingrained and you know, still very much is in the sort of art world in Pittsburgh, it was super, super helpful for me. So and then ever since then, we've always, every time we go to a conference, we room together. Every time, you know, there's something going on, we figure out a way to, like, can I fly into this place, you know, and can we drive together? You know, we try to sort of like always figure out how much can we max our time out together.
That's wonderful. Well, then that leads.
I want to add to that, Brittany.
Oh, she wants to add to that. Okay.
I think one of the things that happens, you know, is, so sure, Sean had heard about my work, and you know, Dusty was his teacher, but I think one of the things that happens in those moments, right, is undergrad and whatever, you know, is that relationship shifts, right, and you become something else, you know. So there might that point where Sean is looking at my work, you know, it becomes more of a shift. It's like, I'm looking at Sean's work, right? Because I'm not being introduced to an undergrad's work when I'm in school, because I don't, you know, nobody's looking at Sean. But then Sean was somebody who was very looked at and put forth in school. So he was very coveted as an undergrad to grad programs. And so people were really looking at him, and, you know, we have become a support network for each other through academia and through school. And so that's something that has meant a lot to me. And so I think that, you know, as it shifts, even though that time where Sean's looking up to me at one point, it's, you know, now both, at least for me, both ways, you know, I look up to Sean in many ways, and they've become a support network for me as an artist and a person. So I think that's something, and Bemis was our shift of sort of becoming closer, because I needed help. And Bemis is in Omaha and Sean was in Lincoln, but I just needed printmaking support there. And Karen Kuntz and Sean really, really gracious to let me go use that space, and really just Sean, because Karen wasn't there. So she put it on Sean. But it was really great. And I think it's sort of like now, you just, as we were telling you before, Brittany, I just don't feel like there's a time where I haven't known.
Yeah.
So.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're part of each other's families.
Well,
Laura comes to my
house for
parents
Christmas. So
yeah, Laura, you know, Lenore comes to my parents at Christmas, and you know, that's just like, you know, that's just how it is now. So yeah, we're always, yeah, we talk a lot. We're just, yeah, it's been like a very long time now, it feels like, but it's been, we collaborate in the form of exhibitions quite a bit, you know, like this is our second now, and we're always thinking about more things to do together, and yeah, always thinking about how our work can, you know, fit together quite a bit.
Well, that kind of leads to the next question then, you know, how did this particular show come to be? And I'm going to kind of scroll through some installation shots as you talk about how did this show come about?
Conversations? I don't know, I feel like just talking back and forth and conversations, and
yeah, I feel like every couple of years we're always looking for ways to show together. You know, I think the last time we did this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where we showed together. And I think both of our work has changed quite a bit in those 2 to 3 years. So I think for us, it was a natural sort of thing to sort of say, hey, why don't we propose this and have another show together? And I think we both sort of knew that, like, it was going to be very different than the previous show, and there were going to be a lot of new things. And I think it just sort of stemmed from having like, I wouldn't really call them studio visits, but they do feel like that, like when we talk on the phone for 2 hours, or like, you know, like I'll get a text of like what Lenore's working on, or like I'll send a quick little picture of something that I'm working on in the studio. And I think it just sort of naturally evolves into like, oh, this would look amazing together, you know. And I think just the idea of home and this idea of like defining that word for ourselves, as we, you know, move through the world, things happen in our lives, et cetera. I think we were sort of both, you know, we're both dealing with that all the time. And so it just sort of seemed like a logical, evolution, you know, to sort of like come back again, you know, and have another show together. So I don't know. That's sort of how I felt about it.
I do too. And I think there's a real Midwesternness to both of us too. So like, I think we're both real. I mean, I'm from Wisconsin, Sean's from Ohio. I think there's a real solid Midwest thing about both of us. And that while I don't think it's like the basis of our work necessarily, I think it's just in who we are. And so I think there's that underlying thing in our work always. And even though our work is changing all the time, it's interesting to me that there's ways that Sean's and my work come together almost always. You know, early on, we were both really dealing with abstraction when very few people, especially in printmaking, were. And so there was a natural draw to want to talk about that. You know, and now this idea of home, which was it's not that Sean and I were like, let's both deal with home, like let's talk about that. It's just where we both happen to be dealing with things.
So it just kind of landed at the right time in the right place, where you were both kind of dealing with similar themes, but in different ways.
They definitely come from very different places and different
right.
Different the way, you know, where the work is intentionally coming from is not, you know, it's not where Sean is taking it and where I'm taking it are not the same inspiration, but there is crossover in what we talk about.
And like a very big aesthetic crossover too. I think a lot of times, you know, like Lenore's referencing sort of working in abstraction and, you know,
formalist.
You know, I think that's the draw right to each other, is like, oh, this is a person who has these very similar, like specific similarities to my work. And so just in visual alone. And so you start, you know, that starts to lend itself, you know, more and more. And I think that even if it looks very distant in that realm, it's still, I see it very closely together actually quite a bit, because I think we both look at space very, very, very similarly, and how we reduce things down and how we look at information and all that stuff. I think it's very, very like very similar. And so that's also another reason that it just sort of seems like one of those perfect sort of like, you know, pairings, and why we would want to show together all the time is really because of that. It's just this like, you know, even if the work conceptually was very, very different, it would still look almost similar, or, you know, there would be a vein that would run through the work. And I think that will always be there.
Right. I mean, aesthetically, just, you know, talking about the formal elements of your work, like clearly there is a kinship there, palette wise too, and just kind of, I think, an attention to composition and line. Yes, so there's a lot of formal things, but also conceptually, it seems like even though you're working in different places, the two of you come together and meet in certain places. So Sean, I'm going to start with you. I have this, I'm just going to keep moving you around on the screen. Okay, so your work in the show is grouped into 4, what I'm calling vignettes. Each addresses a different part of the home. So this is the one that's actually right behind me right now. And it's kind of the first thing you see when you walk into the space. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this grouping. This one focuses on exterior elements like foundations, vents, concrete slabs, siding, obviously. So what does this have to do with your definition of home?
Mhm. I think, I sort of look at land and I look at the built environment in terms of consumerism a lot of times, whether that's home or commercial spaces. It all seems tied to very one thing, which I feel like home itself is tied to, a very consumerist sort of like thing. We buy things for it. We buy the house, right? We sort of buy land that actually isn't ours to buy in terms of the history of the land. And I, think about this idea of like the dream home and how we want to create an idealized space and what we want to attain, what we hope to attain, or what we've been told to attain by others, or sort of perceptions of like, what is home supposed to be. And I think, we're led a lot of times to believe that we have a choice in that, and that sort of design thinking. But most of those are sort of controlled and pre-planned for us. We think like, oh, if we labor over this color, this paint chip, that means that it's going to be ours. But like, there's thousands of other people that are going to also be doing that. So this taking these ideas and making them into the sort of menu in these vignettes, and I think that term is perfect. I was sort of like, are they constellations, are they vignettes? I don't really have a language for them yet because it is so fresh, but I do think about that idea of like this menu of options for all these ideas to create a home, to make us feel like an individual, to make us feel settled, to make us feel comfort, to make, all these things, to not make us feel like, oh, I painted that thing the wrong color, or I had to live with someone else's design choice or something like that. So, I think the grouping of exterior objects reflects an idea, and maybe not even mine in particular, that home is constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. We're constantly being provided with something new and shiny and plastic, usually, because I think a lot of times there is this back and forth of blurring between like a real object, like a foundation is a cinder block, right? But siding is not wood. Siding is generally, stamped metal or vinyl or something like that, but it always has like a wood grain sort of like printed or like embossed into it. So this idea of fake and real is always sort of there too. And can we feel comfort in home with these fake materials? I don't know. My answer is no, myself. So, I think there's that, and that, that evolution of home, but also that, I think that the work speaks to frustrations about home ownership in general, where, as I'm someone who does not own a home, because of educational educational, that was a slip, educational debt, and a lack of generational wealth, and plenty of other issues that sort of surround housing inequalities, and also just access to loans and things like that, which I feel like aren't really horrible for me. They're way worse for other people in this world, but there are constant barriers to that. So I think that the definition is fluid, and just like home is fluid, and hopefully this sort of like menu can be a more finite start to that, or maybe stop to that fluidity, to sort of play with humor a little bit, but also because like the vinyl is a sticker on the wall, literally it's a printed sticker, and that seems sort of like silly to me. The bricks are paper, but then to pair them with these images that are, of these moments or these items, to sort of talk about like this sort of very much in between and sort of liminal stuff that happens in sort of all the sides, inside, outside of our home.
Right. So if we look, for example, at this piece, which actually is just right behind my head here, just first of all, just to give you all warning, in 1 minute, this Zoom might end. And I'm not really sure why this is happening, but if it does, everyone just go back to the same link again. I'm so sorry. It's saying that it's going to end in less than a minute, but I'm not sure if that's actually true. But Slab, you talked to me about this work at length when you were here. I love the way that you have objectified this very common, not attractive, but integral part of construction. And I think that you even told me a little bit about a particular technique that you used for this work. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it's, again, taking those mundane things and trying to really find some sort of beauty in them. And in this case, it was a concrete slab that I was sort of staring at while I was assisting Jeffrey Dell, who's a screen printer, printmaker, artist. Yeah, so I was working, Jeffrey Dell, who's an artist and printmaker who uses a very specific technique, asked me to be an assistant at Penland one summer. And one of the things I've always had sort of somewhat trouble with is rendering by hand. I don't draw a lot. I'm not with pencil and, dry media, wet media, I'm not that kind of maker. A lot of my stuff is heavily digital first. And so I wanted to sort of understand how to sort of create, something that, I've been meaning to create, through this process. And it's essentially, painting or creating a mixture that's alcohol and powdered toner, just out of like a Xerox style printer, toner printer, mixing that together, painting it on like a frosted mylar that has a bit of a tooth to it, making sure it's dense enough, and then shooting that film at several different times, both underexposing it, exposing it, and overexposing it, and then printing those layers over each other in a transparent color of your choice. And that's how you get that sort of depth. So the one thing that had always eluded me was in my practice was making concrete. I just could never get the color correct. I could never get the depth. There's quite a lot of depth in concrete when it comes to the surface and the color, and I just could never do it. And this was one of those moments where I was, it clicked and I got it and I was able to do it. So,
and it's
it's
really lovely
moment.
It's a lovely texture. I mean,
Yeah.
Seeing it on this screen doesn't really give it justice, but you captured it. You captured it. And throughout the show, you have several what I call free to take items that I think come some as a bit of a surprise. What might first look like a sculptural object, like for example, in this case, a pile of bricks is, and look, I even have some video here, is actually notepads.
Yeah.
Oh, you even have one.
Yeah, I kept one. I still sort of have one.
So you're toying with trompe l'oeil. You're toying with, I love that you're inviting the viewer to touch a work of art, not only to touch a work of art, but to liberate and take a work with them as part of the experience of viewing the show. And this one, I think, really is the one that pushes the envelope the furthest. The cabinets that are up on the wall that look like sculptural objects are trompe l'oeil, and they're actually also notepads. So what inspired you to create these?
Oh, yeah, lots. I think that a big part of my practice is field work, and that field work is going to Lowe's, going to Home Depot. And a lot of times they have these like sort of takeaways that are perfect bound along the top that, you can, if it's information about roofing or shingles, for instance, like there's a sort of takeaway option, or, lumber, or it just tends to be an item that I found quite a bit in spaces that are related to sort of either DIY culture or, home ownership. And I was like, there's something to do with this. The first ones I ever did were the grass patterns that you showed. And that was really quite a bit about like taking something so simple as like mowing a lawn, which I had never really had to do before in my life until I moved to where I currently live. And I mean, besides like doing it at my parents' house, of course, like growing up as a chore, but then but I started really thinking about like patterns and like how that becomes like a signifier of, you know, class and status. And like if you mow your yard a certain way, people will think, you know, certain things about you. I mean, it really is very true. Or if you have your yard mowed for your lawn mowed for you. But I love this idea of like, it really was sort of a test to see what people would take more of when I first did it. And so I love that idea of like being pulled to an item, to a pattern, to a thing, and then sort of seeing the results of that. And I think, yeah, the bricks were one of those things where I just wanted to make bricks. It was really that simple. And I had sort of, when we went into sort of like sheltering in place sort of early on in 2020, I made sort of a mock-up, and because our duplex is brick on the outside, and it was sort of just this like logical thing to start looking at my own space and replicating the things in the space. But building it up over several different like tones of red was really important to me, because they go from orange to maroon to brick red, and so color, or the that's where also like a paint chip sort of comes into play. But what I love about the bricks is that they also become a wall if you take all of those individual sheets off and put them up on a wall and sort of lay them out perfectly with like mortar lines around them. You can sort of like a brick and a wall sort of become, I don't know, there's the larger object and the smaller object that it's made up out of. That's sort of maybe a little bit more of a like sort of like more conceptual idea, but I sort of am drawn to that. And yeah, the cabinets too, sort of that idea, like there's so many of them and they're all the same. Yeah, thanks Ruben and Loring for talking about Felix Gonzalez Torres, because I mean, like that was the first time I interacted with artwork in a museum's setting specifically. I remember the first time I saw a takeaway piece by Felix Gonzalez Torres in Chicago, at the Modern in Chicago, or the Contemporary in Chicago rather. And I was floored by this idea, not only of the way that it can be accessible, to almost everyone, but that it breaks down, it blurs that sort of space between, putting something in a frame versus, holding on to it, taking it with you. It's now a part of the person. So this idea of like depleting things is also very much a Gonzalez Torres idea as well. And so he's sort of always in my thoughts when I'm making this sort of endless addition work, as I sort of call it. It doesn't stop. It just, I print more and I redo it, and it's never finished. It will maybe peek its head out in a different way next time, but it's always similar and always sort of the same, which I love too.
I do like that idea though about like Felix Gonzalez Torres, as you take a piece of candy or you take a piece, it changes not only the shape of things, but it actually changes the meaning too. Yeah. And so I've been watching people come, very gingerly approaching these items, and you have to really reassure them it's okay. You can take them. There is this huge barrier. I'm thinking about like the museum as a temple. I'm thinking about, all of those, kind of things that critics were talking about around the same time as Felix Gonzalez Torres was working actually about that barrier between viewership and the work. And you've done a great job of breaking that barrier down in this show. And you've also used a ton of different techniques. So my favorite though would have to be this one, which is ceiling fan number 1, which is this lovely screen print of a ceiling fan, but it's actually, it's hard to see, but he created a popcorn ceiling behind this in the frame using polystyrene and joint compound, and then laid the print on top of it. So I think that's probably your most ambitious idiom.
Yes.
In the show.
Yeah.
But you also have hot stamped foil, which is a really lovely work. I think it just pops. But my favorite of your techniques, of course, is the riso. not just because I use Riso, but also I like the different ways that you've used it. Okay, so you've used it here for popcorn ceiling number 1, which is an image of a popcorn ceiling that then you risographed. But you also used Riso for all of the notebooks, correct? So all of the notebooks, the ones that you're seeing here on the left are actually the vacuum patterns that are made on carpet, you know, when you do those vacuum patterns. You even used Riso to create this beautiful look, as he is Vanna Whiting for you. Right now they are Vanna Whiting for you. What is it about, why did you choose to use Riso as a technique?
Mostly because I think, well, I want to, before I start getting into this, I want to like say that like we are very fortunate that the institution that I work at, like we were able to get a brand new Riso with several drums, and we're able to buy more drums you know, fairly frequently. So it's definitely something that not, you know, a lot of people have to rely on sort of older machines and like rehabbing them and things like that. So it's really it's a very special piece of equipment. And also shout out to Brianne Trammell, who is here in the audience, who taught me hot foil stamping, and is also my sort of Riso partner in crime. And so, you know, there's something about that Riso that I can translate things very quickly, my ideas. I tend to make long lists of work I need to make. And as you can see in some of the prints in the show, I tend to labor quite a bit over them. They are very precise, and they are very clean, and they are very tight. And the Riso actually allows me to sort of release quite a bit of that. I think it does still show its, you know, it shows up in other ways in the Riso, but it sort of, I have to relinquish some control quite a bit. And that is really good for someone who's very controlling of their work. And so, yeah, there's something about, so that quickness, but also it makes you make decisions in a certain way. And you have to sort of go with the flow with it. You know, it has these inconsistencies. It has these sort of little things that have to, you have to allow happen. But also it makes things very quick. And I can make like those bricks very quickly, you know, quote unquote. I don't know if they were still weeks, but you know, to print, you know, many reams of, you know, red shades of paper, you know, double-sided, you know, and there's something about that I just love, that sort of, you know, quickness. But I also love that it never dries. You know, like, you know, because it's soy based, and all of this like wonderful stuff that happens, like when you touch those brick pads, that burgundy ink comes off on your hands, just like a brick sort of has those like that sandy sort of texture that comes off a real brick. I love the idea of the cabinets, because, you know, cabinets are prone to fingerprints, but yet now you are putting, like, they start to smudge in a sort of similar way. You know, the grass is, you know, ephemeral, just like actual grass. Carpet vacuum patterns as well. These things can sort of like degrade over time, and they are never meant to be sort of finite. Whereas I think some of the framed things can be finite, and I, you know, sort of pair them with framed Risos, because I can't really reproduce by hand that popcorn ceiling texture that you have on the screen here, because, like, you know, even like photolitho doesn't quite get the small enough dots that the Riso can. So there's this way of leaning into these like very digital things that can sort of help me achieve what I need to achieve, or just be sort of silly with it and fun, and lead to some sort of more humorous thing. So yeah, I'm a big Riso fan, and I still have a lot to learn. I have so many more things to learn with Riso.
Well, I was going to say that your Riso prints are the cleanest, most precise. Okay, the ones here anyway. Okay. So I'm happy to hear that you do work with a newer machine. That makes me feel a little bit better, because, you know, working with an older machine like the one we have getting this kind of quality, like the quality that you have in these folded exhibition guides, is just fantastic.
Yeah.
But actually now I'm going to move to Miss Lenore Thomas. Lenore, so one body of work in the show that sticks out to me, possibly because of the title of the show, are these sweeping views of roads, these lovely vistas of winding highways and mountaintops. So could you talk a little bit about these? And I think you, when we first met in the gallery, you did tell me a little bit about these, but are these actual locations? And how does this reflect on your kind of ideas about home?
They are all real locations. They're, initially I started, this work is not as current as some of the work in the show. So when Sean and I were talking about doing the show, and the space, because the space that you're in, the people aren't seeing the whole space. There's a whole nother second room there. It's quite large. And so we talked about, how we wanted to fill the space. And, I'd made a bunch of new work. And this work, this body of work, this landscape work has sort of spanned a decade or so. Sort of, the sort of the more core of it is maybe the last 6 or 7 years, but so the one we're looking at right now is Rochester, New York. The one previous to that was Portland, Oregon. So in the titles, this one is Pittsburgh. The titles all have to do with something that was said about that place. So, like, by the way, this place is a creep hole was actually said about Rochester. So it's something that a friend or somebody in my earshot said about that place. So there is a whole series that's not in the show that is actually called I'm an hour ahead of being more awesome than you, that Sean actually said about moving from Lincoln to Pittsburgh. So there's a whole series of 5 pieces about Pittsburgh named by Sean, that Sean actually has one of. So the pieces initially were more in my brain, were more academic, and dealt a lot with space and perspective, and thinking about how to create that visual space. So I do photograph actual places as I'm moving between those spaces as I drive through them. And the patterns usually have to do with those spaces. So I've made them about Fayetteville, Arkansas. I've made them, and they're all over the country. But as I started to make this more recent body of work, I started to realize that these places are my search for home. And so as I drive through them, I'm looking for this place that I feel grounded in. So last year, as I drove out to a residency in Utah with Stephanie Dykes and at Saltgrass Printmakers. And as I was driving, it really struck me that as I look at these landscapes, I'm really looking for this place, this grounding place that I call home. And I hit Wyoming, where I have 2 friends who really feel like Wyoming is like this place for them. And so I decided to make one about Wyoming, because I was like, why is Wyoming not my place? Like, why is this place, like, why are these places not my places, including my own home state of Wisconsin? And so I made the one about Wyoming, which is also in the show. And, it just hit me that as I looked back at these pieces, that's really what they were. And so, it speaks a lot to how your work can be one thing at one time. And as you look back at it, it can shift. The ideas about your work can shift as you change and as you as your person and your ideas shift. So and so I really started to think about them as different. These pieces are all based in different places. So there's some about Las Vegas and some about Pittsburgh. So 2 of them were made for the last show that Sean and I did together, and one of them is more recent.
Well, the reason I was showing these was to kind of talk a little bit about the many different techniques you use to create these images. And as you can see, I think you can see really easily here, the built up layers. So you're using various intaglio techniques, letterpress, screen printing, collage, actual painting. So it's kind of a mishmash of techniques. But these stacked series, for example, can you talk a little bit about how you created these?
So they're the circles, the actual stacks are paintings, like painted acrylic, MDF, and then there's these ones are all screen prints and intaglio, and that are mounted. I do them all first, and then I mount them, and then I cut them out on the wood. And again, I was, thinking about place, but also thinking about these places as some sort of, I don't know, thinking about them dimensionally, but also thinking about them as these like cut out moments of time, or like trying to think about the depth of those places. And I imagine in my brain, I imagined many of them, like moving through this space with many of them, but then my brain shifted to a different body of work before I moved through all of them. I have so many of these circles in my studio, like insane amounts of these circles in my studio. So it's not to say that I won't come back to them, but my brain shifted to a different body of work before I ended up moving through all of this.
Well, in a way, you would say that these are autobiographical. They're related to locations that you've either traveled to, you've lived, you've spent time in. But the other body of work in the show is much more decidedly autobiographical in both content and in kind of execution. So this body of work speaks more directly to your personal home, your family, and your childhood. And the installations, as you can see in this corner, include a stool that you made in middle school shop class, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That's the one with the fur on top. And then you totally delighted me by telling me that you had a stool from your childhood replicated by...
I replicated
Oh,
it.
you replicated it. Okay. By looking at photos.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were able to recreate a stool made by your grandfather.
Didn't look at photos, it's from my brain. So.
Oh, you didn't even have photos? Yeah. That makes it even more astounding. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you have the cigarettes, and then you have plates and linens from your family kitchen. But I wanted to kind of start with the most prominent work in the show, and not only because of it visually is so arresting, but also because the smell that is present in the gallery. It's the cigarettes. They're a recurring theme in your work in the show, and a large part of this installation is about smoking. So could you talk a little bit about the impetus for these cigarette pieces?
Yeah. So my mom was a smoker. And so there's 2 things to this. One sits with something I'm not going to talk about here. And then another part is that my mom smoked, but she smoked secretly. And secretly, as we all say, like nobody smokes secretly, but and in the 70s when everybody smoked, she smoked fine, when everyone did. And then at some point she had breast cancer and she stopped. And then at some point she started again. We were all out of the house. And so when we would come home, she would, hide that she would smoke. But of course you can smell it. And there was something that always just sort of struck me about that idea of secrets. And I talk a lot about this in my artist statement, and just things that families do. And I think, on some level, everybody has secrets in their lives, right? And so some families have them more or less. And so that need for secret, to not want to talk about it or not tell or whatever that was, we also never asked. And I think there's that knowing that you just don't want to, you're not supposed to, or it's going to make her uncomfortable, or something is not, you're not supposed to. So in this piece, I had friends who saved their cigarette butts for me, and very kindly, and I wanted to make a piece that was both about that saving of like sort of this thing of like these secrets, these things pouring out of the house. There's also another element to that. There's like the cigarettes just kind of come up in difficult ways, right? So I think a lot of my work, like including this piece, is the complicatedness of all of this, right? It's I mean, they're gross and they smell, and it smells bad, and but it's also there's a lot of pain there. Hiding a secret can be really difficult, and who knows what's going on in somebody's head why they need to do that. The house is yellow. That's my mother. Yellow always represents my mom in my work. It's her favorite color. So when you see that from me, yellow is a very happy color. So I like the contrast of that sort of like really kind of bright and happy mixed against this sort of, grungy dirtiness. And, I think in the other pieces that I don't know if we're going to talk about, but like there's this issue, not so much in these, but when I use these cigarettes otherwise, there's a lot of vulnerability for me in those pieces. And it's a complicated thing for me. Like this use of cigarettes in the work becomes a source of my own judgment from my mother on hiding the cigarettes, and then also my release of judgment on her, and understanding that. So the drawing on the right side of the screen is drawn with a lit cigarette. So I am smoking the cigarette to make the drawing, and I did this again out in Utah with that residency at Saltgrass, and I had to do a lot of my own judgment on like releasing of judgment, and I really did have these moments of clarity on letting go of where my mom was at, where my mom's head might have been at. I can't ever really know, but making the drawing and making that, and also there's a lot of funny stories around it, like buying the cigarettes and just being like, oh God, like I don't smoke, like telling people who could not care that I smoked or not, but getting really defensive, and like people, I'm sure Stephanie remembers this, but it's like people from the coffee shop next door would be like, I saw you drawing outside. I'm like, I don't smoke cigarettes. And they weren't even asking anything about whether I smoked or not. Like, they're just like, I saw you drawing outside. Like, so there's all this like my own issues and my own not wanting to be judged for something I didn't do. And just putting that back on my mom and just being like, really here, like feeling that what it might have been like for her to just want to do something that she wanted to do without having somebody criticize her. So, and so there's a lot of power for me in all of that work, but it's also complicated. It's also very complicated.
And I think the most touching work in the show is obviously this one. And now that you've told me about the yellow, I understand the kind of meaning of the yellow. So representing, you physically screen 75 layers of ink onto this piece of paper to signify the 75 years of your mother's life. And I love the fact that you left this unglazed so that you can actually get up on it and look at the depth on the side. So I know that this is a really powerful piece for you. Sean, you also have some autobiographical work in the show.
Yeah.
I remember the story that you told me about fence roll, which I actually have a really quick video to share.
Oh, nice.
So people can see.
It just makes me laugh every time.
Right.
There
And
it
I
is.
have some
Ugh,
right here.
so
So
silly.
just really quick, we only have 7 minutes left, but until this is gonna unfortunately close again. This is a disaster, but
Okay.
could you tell us a little bit about physically how you created this work?
Yeah.
And where it comes from in your own past?
Yeah. So the building that my studio is in, there are these sort of other like little offices and programs for the institution, and they were putting flooring in somewhere. I can actually just show it to you after. This like lives in my studio. It's this like vinyl flooring that like is fake wood grain, and it's like it's clearly printed, but then it's also stamped with a wood grain texture. And so all I did one day was just like ink it up and with black relief ink, and printed it on a piece of newsprint, scanned that in, and sort of elongated it and created this from an Ose, which is a toner printer. It's 3 feet wide by the roll, and I just printed, probably hundreds of them, and then hand cut them all out, and then sort of hand rolled them. And again, it's that idea of like, lots of paper materials come in rolls, and wood is one of those things, that does stem from paper often. And this idea of, sort of physically unrolling something to build this larger thing, this sort of like on demand, literally print on demand, build on demand, etc., embodying itself in sort of the role, and mimicking things, I've seen in, my childhood friends' dads' workshops, where they would like hang things up with string, or they would sort of do these very simple things to like put things in a space. I didn't want to labor over too much how to display this. So and a lot of this comes from the idea of all of my work has always dealt with some sort of boundary, and barriers are the sort of physical manifestations of boundaries in the built environment and in the landscape. And when I first moved, when I moved further west in the South, there was a lot of fences, and so this idea of thinking about like, is it welcoming, is it not, and this idea of fences containing but also keeping things out. This is my space, that is your space, but how can these things be? But that was the first thing I noticed when I moved to the state was a lot of fences and a lot of garage doors. Those were your entry points into homes. And I found that very, very strange, coming from a much older part of the country. I grew up in a house that was from the late 19th century, and was very small, and very much from that time period of even like every house around us is 1800s, right? So one of those things where yeah, this idea that just the land was very different and how it was set up and how people were kept in and out of things was very foreign to me, actually moving to a more suburban space than I have ever experienced in my life. So yeah.
Right. And I've been spending a lot of time in this room with both of your work. And I've had a chance to kind of think about, okay, so first of all, in 3 minutes, we're going to be cut off again. I
Nice.
apologize again. When you return in 3 minutes, we'll have our Q&A.
Perfect.
It's perfect timing, I guess, kind of. But Lenore, I've been spending a lot of time in here, like I said, with both of your bodies of work, and kind of been trying to find intersections, not just in defining concepts of home, but thinking about those liminal and also physical spaces, like the kitchen, for example. And so, you know, Lenore, I know you talked to me at length about this part of your installation. Those plates for me are so evocative. That pattern is like what all my friends had in their kitchens, you know, in the late 70s, early 80s. Those kind of brightly colored linens, you know, it's inviting nostalgia in a way. Even though I know for you that this has a very different connotation. We only have 2 minutes, so I'm gonna, if you could talk just really quickly about this.
I mean, it's both, right? Like it's both the like happiness of all of that stuff, and like those plates are the plates that, you know, my family ate off of. And those are the linen, you know, like those are the linens. You know, I put the yellow one again at the top because my mom loved yellow, and so those are my mom's dish towels. But it's the complicatedness, right? It's the complicatedness of the kitchen being both a place where we gather and home, but also like that house is that color. That's all cigarette ash. Like it's all, so it's the it's not the one or the other. It's the this and the this. It's the things are all of these things. It's the happy and the sad and the angry and the difficult and the pain. So it's all of those things. It's not that it's just the one thing. So,
which I think says a lot to family, you know, and definitions of family, you know, the complicated levels of that. But then also I was kind of thinking about looking at both of your takes on the kitchens, you know, like the kitchen is also a place where people use design to kind of define themselves, especially now, more so than then. You know, what fixtures do you choose? All of these things are kind of reflected in Sean's, but Western culture has kind of a code for what constitutes a nice kitchen. And I think that in a way, Sean has kind of exploded that out to a very clinical almost degree. And then you have Lenore's work. All of this reflects an actual kitchen, a time and a place. So both works speak directly to domestic spaces and what they mean to us and different definitions of home. And it's going to cut out here any second. So I'm going to let it just stop. And then I'm so sorry. If everyone could come back, we will have our Q&A, and we shouldn't have any interruptions. Talking about kitchens and how both works speak to domestic spaces and what they mean to us and different ways of defining that and encoding that information. But also I was wondering, both of you, do you see other parallels between your work? I'm sure you have some that you've thought of, obviously, because you put the show together. But then once you actually have it up in the room, I'm just curious if you see other intersections.
Yeah, yes. Yes.
yes.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think the biggest one is the construct of home. I mean, right, like that's the biggest one, right, is that we sort of all create very different versions of these things for ourselves, for others. You know, it's sort of this funny thing that happens. We all sort of enter into these things with our own ideas, but also, you know, things that have influenced us, things that we were raised with, things that we were raised without. You know, in my case, quite a bit, it's a lot of like, I wasn't raised this way. And it was this idea of like, you know, working class attainment to suburban life, and chasing that, right? Or not wanting to chase it, but feeling like you have to. So this idea of the construct, whether that's mental or physical, and how it manifests, you know, mentally and physically, I think, is also, you know, sort of a big thing for both of us. Yeah, so that the construct of home, yeah, I don't know what else, Lenore.
I don't know, we just had a big talk about this. I mean, I think there's, you know, obviously there's the aesthetic visuals that are there. There's the, you know, I think that, I think even though we're conceptually coming at some different angles on these things, that we're looking at a lot of subtle ways that we cope with home, that we have coping mechanisms for home, that we you know, that even though maybe in some ways I talk more about family in my stuff, I don't think that family is necessarily like evident if you just look at the work, but I do think that family is really prevalent in for both of us as a connection. And again, I mean, I talked about this earlier, but I think place is really important. The place that we grew up, the place that we're surrounded in. You know, that you can't kind of take out who you are from the work that you make. And again, that's not always, you know, sometimes what the work ends up being about and what inspires it aren't necessarily the same things, but I do think that those, you know, kind of where we came from, you know, and I do think there's a lot like Sean was just talking about this stuff, you know, you're kind of balancing these, like, you know, this Sean saying working class, you know, like, you know, you're hiding some elements of those things. You're trying, you know, this like this balance between working class and the suburban attainment, you know, and like for me, it was similar things, you know, like my family was poor, and but you know, but we're trying to look a certain way, we're trying to appear a certain way. You know, there's all that kind of stuff that's happening, and again, that just goes along with the complicatedness of what's happening in all of that, you know. But again, like, can you see all of that in the work? Not always. Like, I don't know if you can see it, like, but it's there in the making of the work. Like, I'm not sure it's what the work is there, but it's there in the making of it. So those are the conversations Sean and I might be having.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's always like there in the, like what somebody would take away from that, because that's not, you know, that's just not always what's supposed to be taken away from it.
Well, and I also think there's even just like a technical parallel. I mean, we're talking about making, right? And I think that we are both technicians in every sense of the word when it comes to our practice. Like, we are fussy, you know, we really, I mean, and maybe I'm speaking for Lenore, but I view both of our practices as very fussy, and we will not settle for things, and we are clean, and we are precise, and we are clinician. I mean, we really are, like, we're clinician, you know. It's this very, like you said, like you used clinical earlier, Brittany, and it's very true. Like, I think both of us are drawn to that because that makes us feel comfortable. Again, that's a coping thing probably for both of us a little bit as well. There's a control thing there for both of us. I
was going to put that word on there, Sean. I was going to say,
what?
we're both controlling. So
yeah,
you know,
and it took me a very long time to think that that's not a bad word anymore for me. You know, that's not a negative word. That's it's me. It's how my brain works. It's who I am, and you know, like, you get what you get. And so I think there's this way of making in this technical side that parallels you know, all of these things that, you know, Laura was talking about as well. And you know, I don't think we don't fawn over the process by any means, right? We are not, you know, we don't get we're not technical in that way, but we are highly technical in the sense of like we can make very very specific pivots in the studio. We can rest assured of our abilities in the studio to do certain things and to also learn, right, other new things and to evolve. But there's something about that parallel that I think always draws us in our work together too, is that very specific sort of technical side of it as well.
Well, I think this leads perfectly into a question in the chat.
Thanks.
Actually, Barbara said, the exhibition is beautifully installed. I love the way your work plays off of each other. Can you talk a bit about how the installation came together? And I think there's no better didactic material to show you. I don't know if you guys can see this here, but this is our exhibition guide that Sean created in PDF form with every single work. And there's, this is just one wall of the show. And then, it corresponds with the number down here. This is a work of art in itself. And also when you both arrived, you had everything laid out and ready to go. So can you talk a little bit about your installation kind of technique?
Yeah.
Sean's a nerd.
It's true. I love a graphic. I love exhibition design.
Vinyl.
I love vinyl. Like I love the ancillary things that go along with, I love office supply. I love these weird little things that I don't know. They aren't weird because they really do align very perfectly with who I am actually in my work. But I mean, maybe before we get in, I want to thank Elise, who's here for helping us. So wonderful.
So good, Elise. So good.
Yeah. So nice to have an extra set of hands and to, just have somebody who can get in there and just be like, hey, go hang this way, right? While I do this, and like just to be able to sort of communicate with someone. So thank you so much, Elise. It was really wonderful. And I don't know, I think that I can dive a little bit in first to, I hounded Lenore quite a bit for dimensions before she was doing lots of stuff this summer, because I built everything. Our entire show was built in SketchUp in 3D modeling software. And when I was traveling back west, we sat down in Lenore's living room the night before we came up, and we placed everything virtually, at least just to sort of know what location things would be in. And so, I built all of our framed works, and as much as I could, the sort of sculptural stuff and the sort of three-dimensional stuff, because we knew that time is very precious in those spaces to get a show up. And in the case of, I know all of my work and some of Lenore's work, we had never seen it up full before. I know Lenore has really never seen those shelf pieces in this sort of way, right? Until
we're never up.
Right. In a studio is very different. None of the work of mine in the show I had seen in that arrangement. I had tried to do stuff as I was making it, but so there was a lot of finger crossing, oh, I hope this goes well, but we, sort of to digitally mock it up and then to come in and do it. That was sort of how it came together, I think, was just working very digitally. Even though we had these real things. My work sat in Lenore's studio for almost 2 months before I installed it. I didn't see it for 2 months. I sort of had to drop it off and then go to the Northeast and have a summer and, relax, in the middle of a global pandemic. And I didn't get to see it. So we had to sort of do lots of strange things, but it sort of all came together.
And mind you, we drove up there in some of the craziest storms ever. And so this turned out to be great because when we dropped the work off, we actually were able to set the show up when it was 100 degrees in that space one day, and then just come in with Elise the next day and put the show up relatively in one day, relatively quickly. So that really ended up helping us. The design of the show ended up helping us a lot. We moved a few things around after we visually saw them, but very, very little was changed.
So does anyone have any other questions for these two? You can either unmute yourself and just ask, or you can drop your question in the chat. Anyone?
It can be any kind of question about the show.
Sean just opened it up, Lenore.
About the show.
I was like, what are they talking about?
Oh, I would love to tell you about my dog. And Lenore can also.
How do you know? I'm like, how do you know? But they mean your dog, and I'm.
Oh, that's true. I mean, I just assume
it's
it's
two
Maple,
dogs, and they said your dog. One
that's
dog.
true. Well,
we only got to meet Maple.
But you have your one dog in the show. So.
Yeah. Yeah, Maple came to install the show. She was a trooper. That was her first show install. So she's wonderful, and she is Arkansas born and is every kind of breed of dog. And she's very cute.
Okay, so here's a real question. If the finished work is so clean and controlled, how do you guys let experimentation into the process? And this is another thing that I thought about. You are printmakers.
Yeah.
Which, printmaking, I mean, there's the whole tamarind, like super methodical type of printmaking, and then there's printmaking, right? So no, it wasn't discussed, but I'm just curious about how and when do you allow experimentation to take place?
I mean, I think I'm highly experimental, so I don't, I'd say there's this sort of part where you get really rigid maybe at some point where the sort of output that you want, but there's also the risk taking or whatever. So for instance, when I put the ash all over that house, I was like, I don't know if I want to do this, because the house was really pristine and white, it was a super clean white house, and I just did it, so I think there's always those moments that you're doing that. And I think there's for me, there's always the kind of body of work that I'm doing that's happening that maybe people are seeing, and then there's the body of work that nobody's seen. So so there's always the experiment that's happening. That's where the play is happening, and the things that I'm messing around with are happening. And I know that both Sean and I have other practices. My Yvette Spradlin is here, who is my collaborator. I do a ton of work with her on we do video and a photography mixed media project that I do printmaking and sewing and other collage stuff with. So there's there's so much other so there's other things happening, and then there's all this other work that I'm just doing that nobody's ever seen. So I think there's the output that people see in the world, but then there's all this other stuff that you just don't see because the final project is maybe what you want the world to see. It's just what you're showing, but the experimentation is happening behind closed doors or behind studio doors or with your students, or I don't know, there's just so much happening all the time that maybe it's not the show that's, even if that seems controlled. I think that's for me at least.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's the same. I think I definitely there's work in the show that is my sort of the work I tend to gravitate towards when I need to think through ideas, but is sort of the work that I'm maybe more known for. And then there's the work that is, again, experimental, the pads of paper, even those are extremely experimental. I had to learn quite a bit in that process, how to make padding compound and color it to match the color I needed. And that might seem very sort of simple, but it was a lot of trial and error to sort of get that into days of work and days and days and days. And I think there's a lot of failure that, it's hard to see a lot of times because of that control and cleanliness. But I will say right now that I learned a lot of control and cleanliness from Lenore and watching Lenore work in the studio, to be honest. When Lenore had come down to make prints with us a few years ago, I felt like I learned how to both be to sort of work in a way that was experimental, but still clean and controlled actually quite a bit. I'm forever impressed by Lenore's ability to like not have to wear an apron in the studio sometimes. Like it's something I always want to do, right? Like this idea of being able to wear the clothes you want to wear, right, in the shop, in the lab. Like I love that idea of like, I think it's just who we are, you know. I think that but yeah, that experimentation and that sort of failure at times, it's there. It's very much there. It's just but I think a lot of times only we're seeing it too. And you know, I think it's different for everybody when they're working in the studio. So
well, there's
yeah,
there's one piece in the show that I have that's a little house that's got like cigarette stuff in it, and then it's squirted out and stuff. And that was a total, like, I was just messing around, and you know, it's not actually very controlled at all. It was just messing around, and stuff squirted out and stuff. And it's one of my favorite pieces that I did, you know, but I had to sit with it, and I was like, oh, I really love this. So it could seem really controlled because it could seem like what I wanted, but it wasn't what I wanted. And, you know, and I just had to sit with it for a few days. So
yeah.
Also add that when you print in 5-inch heels every day,
My favorite.
risk does, you know, there's a whole bunch of risk and failure.
My favorite.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
First of all, that's so amazing. Like I'm scared to wear open-toed shoes in here, you know, like.
I mean, you shouldn't, but you do
right. Gonna get OSHA up in here.
Right.
But I wanted to ask really quickly about the title, if that's okay.
Yeah.
No.
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 No. The title is, I love this title. And when I first saw it on the calendar, I was like, ooh, what could that mean? And now seeing your work all together. So I'm just wondering, did you collaborate on the title, or did one of you come up with it? Or do you even remember? Sean's making faces.
It's a title we've had for a while now. It is not something, it is very much in the vein of Lenore's titles. So I would assume it was a larger influence from Lenore, because I do not title things very long. As you can tell, it's numbers, and it's very much in an inventory or an index of my work and my titling. But I used to title things like that. So that's why I don't know. I'm like, okay, well, I used to title things longer, but now I don't. And I don't know.
I think it was a conversation. I think it was a conversation, but I don't remember either.
Tiny roads that lead to nowhere.
This is like, this also speaks to your friendship. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like these things just, they flow, you know, like they flow together over the years. And so you just can't even point out. But I was thinking about, you know, it's usually like tiny roads that lead to home.
Right.
Right. And so in this case, it's no.
Yeah.
Tiny roads lead you to nowhere. And so I kind of love that. So I had to, well, I had you here, I had to ask. Does anyone else, I talk too much. Does anyone else have any questions for them? You can either drop it in the chat or.
While we're waiting, I also want to just go back to the experimentation question. All the hot foil stamped work that I have made, there's only one in the show of the faucet. That was pure experimentation. That was like my colleague Brianne Trammell, like, you know, explaining it to me, showing it to me sort of going in with my knowledge and trying to refine it for my studio practice. And there were, I mean, like, I can't tell you how much paper I wasted, and like foil I went through, and how much screen printing there. I mean, it's layers and layers of glue and gloss medium and all the stuff in it. There are so many failures in that pile that it's frustrating to look at a lot of times. And you only really get one or two good ones out of it. But every foil is different, whether it's silver or gold or orange or blue. And the heat is all different, and the pressure is all different, and so it's a lot of note taking and a lot of like coming into the studio for 8 hours and leaving defeated, and and then also, okay, how do maybe I cannot do this and do this. So yeah, anyways, I was thinking about that as that question was, as I was ending that question earlier, all of a sudden was like, oh, there is this stuff, but it's I'm only picking the best to put in the show. So you don't see it.
I also think that like one thing you don't see too is that all this work, like as you're making it, like, you know, it feels finished in the end, but like as you're making it, it's so like you don't know what you're doing, and you're like, you know, it comes to this point where you're like, I want to try this. Like I remember when I started like the idea of these sculptural houses, they were like flimsy paper, and then they were like all these things, and I had studio visits with Sean. I had studio visits with Barbara Weisberger, who's here. I had studio visits with Ellie Jenkins, who was here. You know, I talk to Yvette all the time. You know, so it's like I'm constantly talking and having visits with artists and art friends and curators, you know, to like get feedback on, you know, in process. And that there is like that you're not seeing too, which feels like, you know, this didn't work, that didn't work. You know, that, you know, like, and it's like you're trying out how to put, you know, to make that thing the right thing, you know, the right way to show it, the right, the I don't know, the right way, if that's not the right, but you know,
What is how it's being,
feels it
how
good,
it's being
you know?
read by others,
Right.
you know, how other people are seeing the work and how they are digesting it, and how, you know, I try to pull in colleagues as much as I can for a studio visit, because it's hard when you teach, you know, to have that time and that space, really, because your time is dedicated to teaching or service to the institution. And so one of my things I made sure of last year while I was preparing for this whole show was to have studio visits with my colleagues in sculpture, you know, my colleagues in photography, because I'm using photography, I'm using sculptural elements, I'm using these things that they have a vocabulary for that I don't quite yet. And I think that, you know, building a community when you're a educator, professional, it can be very hard, but you sort of have to, you have to bring people in, you have to show the work before it's shown, to talk, to figure things out, to work through ideas. You know, a lot of the like sort of methods of display came from talking with a new sculpture faculty here, you know, and just this idea of like how they were understanding, you know, these sort of tear away things versus how I was understanding them. And you know, they have experience with making artist books, they have all this stuff, so we have a language and we have you know, spaces that blur over each other, but you know, they had a very different approach to viewing my work, and a different language for my work that was really, really helpful, that I could go back into the studio and sort of tweak things and like learn from that visit. It's been a big thing for me lately to like re-find a community of, you know, artists. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, COVID just further complicates this, so exacerbates it so much, you know, obviously here at Zygote, you know, we are a collaborative printmaking shop. So not having that opportunity for community and those connections has been really difficult, but I'm so happy that we were able to get this show physically into the space so that people could come and see it and have that experience. In fact, I was going to share with you, some people just dropped by today, a woman and her son, and he wants to become a community member. And they walked through this gallery and were not only entranced, they wanted a piece of every single notepad. So yeah, you should have seen the stack when they left. And they got the spirit of it, you know, like and that is a connection we would not have had we not had this physically. So I'm just so thankful to both you, Sean, and Lenore, for all of our many schedule changes and technical mishaps during this artist talk, but we're all still here. And I just love your work so much. And I've been so pleased to be able to spend so much time with it and to have the chance to talk to you and ask all of my questions. I know there were other people here, but in my mind, it was just me talking to you. But it is 7:30, so I'm gonna call it. But if anyone has, first of all, if anyone is interested in purchasing any of these beautiful works in the show, you can email me at brittany@zygotepress.org. Jackie also dropped a bunch of the links. So there's a virtual exhibition, the virtual walkthrough, the gallery page. If you're in the Cleveland area, we're open Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays for viewing through August 29th. So you still have plenty of time to come see this beautiful show. Any last thoughts? No?
Bruce, thank you so much for,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you so much
Thank you,
for
guys.
everything.
Sean, Lenore, I can't wait to see you again because you're gonna come here and take
Yep.
all of this down. So
We'll be there.
I'm guaranteed getting to see you in the flesh again. And thank you again for participating in this artist talk. I will be seaming the multiple videos together into a YouTube presentation.
Lovely.
So you can share it. We'll be sharing it on our social media and you can share it with people that missed it. And they won't even know about all the spaces because it's like, you know,
It'll be flawless.
it was fly. I will edit. I'll do star wipes, you know. It'll be great. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thanks again,
Yeah.
Sean, Lenore.
Bye.
Talk to
Thank
soon.
you.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.